The New Zealand Business Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, your strategic and proactive IT partner.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Business Podcast. Real privilege today to join Ed Sims in the studio. Welcome along, Ed. How are you?
Morena, thank you, Paul. Very well indeed. Thank you. Very looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, look, it's a real privilege to sit down with you. Fascinating chatting before we started, and just getting a little bit of a taste of how you started out. A check-in agent at Gatwick, and you most recently sort of exited from CEO role at WestJet in Canada. Business that sold a couple of years ago for I think north of $6 billion New Zealand dollars. So.
Correct.
An absolutely incredible journey. So really looking forward to delving in. Maybe we can start at the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, for sure.
And what was that journey through to check-in agent?
Well, I think I'm a classic example of careers being more of a lattice work than a ladder. It's never straight up. You have to take sideways moves, and sometimes you take some backwards moves. I was born in a place called Swansea in South Wales in the UK, one of four kids. Neither of my parents were in business. They were both academics. So the whole business world was a bit of a mystery to them as it was to me. In school, I loved creative writing. And I then studied English literature, went to Oxford, and I thought it would be a cool thing to actually be able to write in a way that somebody would be persuaded to buy something. So I started thinking maybe I could work at an ad agency, maybe I could be a copywriter. And then I realized there was this whole world called marketing where, the power of writing actually persuaded somebody to buy something. And then I started thinking, well, what might be an interesting environment? And I was really unsure. And I was pretty sure I didn't want to go into one of these schemes where you ended up, selling pet food or toilet rolls or something. So as a kind of interim and a holding pattern, I thought, well, I've never been in an aircraft, so why don't I try and work at Gatwick Airport? So I worked at check-in at Gatwick Airport, and it was, a weird time because I didn't actually understand how the process worked. So that was a great opportunity for me to see right at the coalface what people were looking for when they went on holidays. And this was back in the 80s in the UK. People used to go, to Spain typically for a couple of weeks, get pretty drunk at the time, and get pretty drunk before they got on the flight.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes, my job on a Friday night would be clearing people out of the pub just so I could persuade them to go and check in the first place.
Wow.
And they were quite happy to stay in the pub, and they'd pretty much forgotten that they were meant to be going on holiday. So, I had some pretty hairy experiences.
Wow. So this is a pub in the airport?
This was a pub at the airport, yeah. It was called the Gatwick Village Inn, and there was a particular flight that was an 11:30 flight to Corfu that I remember people used to get absolutely steaming. And my very first boss was a lovely lady called Leslie, and she drummed into me, if you're going to work in check-in, the customer's always right. And she started checking in one of these Friday night Corfu flights, and there were a bunch of leery guys, making very suggestive comments. And I remember her using her clipboard to great effect, whacking these guys around the head. And after we'd got this flight away, I turned to her and I said, just remind me, Leslie, the customer's always right. And she said, sometimes you just do what it takes. And that was a great lesson
Wow.
in the world of airlines. And so that's really how I started, Paul. And at that time, there was a huge charter industry in the UK, and all of those charter airlines were owned by what were called tour operators, just, travel organizational companies. And so I ended up working in tour operating, and that's where I guess I learned to write, because I was actually writing holiday brochures, and I was using lots of phrases like picturesque fishing village and
yes,
all of those great cliches from brochures. And that's how I guess I harnessed in the early stages my ability to persuade somebody to buy something, and started traveling on aircraft and started going to spend time in Spain and Greece and, some of the great ski resorts. And I was absolutely hooked, and I loved the industry, and spent a good, probably getting on for 13, 14 years in the UK in the holiday industry, running travel agencies, running retailers, but also wholesaling and working in supply chain. So it was a great broad base. And, I guess as I worked through a career in what was at the time called vertically integrated distribution, I'd been introduced to, at the time, the Elon Musk of the industry, Sir Richard Branson, and I ended up working for Sir Richard Branson before I left the UK, and it
Wow.
was an extraordinary experience.
So what was it that opened that door to work for Branson?
One of the things I learned from Sir Richard was, he always watches his competition. And I was working for one of the big competitors for one of his brands, and he wanted to extract someone from the competition. Richard had this incredible knack. If he saw somebody who he thought was brilliant at customer service, he would just make a point of saying, "Have you ever wanted to work for an airline?" And a lot of his best flight attendants, a lot of the best staff within Virgin had started by working for a competition or working for a completely unrelated industry. So I guess he'd seen some of the work I was doing for some of his competitive businesses and asked me to come in and run what turned out to be a very, very early .com business.
Wow.
And it was one of the very first digital travel businesses.
So yeah, run us through that, launching a digital travel business for Sir Richard Branson.
Well, at the time, the thing I learned so much from Sir Richard, but one of the things I learned is that he had this extraordinary appetite for risk. I mean, the sort of appetite for risk that you and I couldn't sleep at night. And he managed at the time about 45 different Virgin brands, totally different independent Virgin entities. So one of the businesses that I was developing was a sort of almost like a travel redemption business that would become the glue or the currency that if you had a phone plan through Virgin Mobile, if you banked through Virgin Finance, if you went to a gym called Virgin Gym or you drank Virgin Cola, you could earn and redeem points through a company that he charged me to develop called Virgin Travel Store, which was an extension of Virgin.com. And it really was, I think, one of the very first .com digital travel agencies. And there were a couple of challenges. One, it proved enormously popular for airlines generally because they realized they could actually sell a lot of their product. And at one point, probably quite undiplomatically, I realized I was actually selling more British Airways seats than I was of home airline Virgin Atlantic.
Wow. Wow. And that was just a sort of market share type thing and so on that
absolutely.
Virgin Atlantic was a sort of smaller player, British Airways huge, but that would have created did that create a few problems?
It created a little bit of competitive tension, because at the time there was a bigger .com travel agency called lastminute.com, and we were really competing with them. And the only way I could see that we could compete with Last Minute was by selling anybody and everybody.
Yeah.
But clearly Atlantic weren't too keen on the idea of this homegrown Virgin business selling more British Airways seats. And I think we were one of those very early pioneering companies that got caught between conventional distribution. I had a couple of pretty large call center operations and finally having the confidence to go fully digital. And, of course, the world feels very different now, but back in 1999, that was a huge leap of faith. And eventually I felt we should have run dual streams. There were voices within Virgin saying, go purely digital. And so we parted ways very amicably. And my wife was a New Zealander, and she said, well, maybe this is the time that we think of going to live down under. And so Richard at the time was very keen for me to come and work for a fledgling operation he was setting up at the time that was called Virgin Blue, that then became Virgin Australia as an Australian domestic airline. And again, being the competitive soul, I thought it would be quite fun to go and compete with them. And I didn't make a great choice, and I went to work for a company called Ansett Australia. And I was the head of retail distribution for Ansett Australia. I was running 800 travel agents in Australia. But sadly, that went under.
That business hit the wall of quite sort of spectacular. Spectacular is maybe the wrong word, but it was very public. Air New Zealand bought that entire Ansett Australia business, didn't they?
Well, that's right. They went from a 50%
about bankrupted Air New Zealand, didn't it?
Very nearly. They went from a 50% share to 100% share. It wasn't great timing. And one of the great lessons I took from that period, Paul, was, keep businesses simple, don't overcomplicate. Ansett Australia had become an enormously complex operation, multiple fleet types, too many destinations, really complex labor relations with a lot of their staff, and owning 800 travel agents. So I was in this invidious business, having been asked to come and run part of the operation that was part of the problem. It was part of the complexity. So the business was losing a lot of money, but the final nail was really 9/11. I remember vividly flying very early one morning, on that morning from Melbourne to Sydney, watching this unfold at Melbourne Airport and watching, a lot of my former colleagues or current colleagues as check-in agents, watching this in total disbelief. And the thought was going through my head, this could be the end of Ansett. This could be the end of us. And indeed, we went under about 4 days later. And as you say, with the 100% shareholder at the time, Air New Zealand, that left Air New Zealand with an enormous financial hole. In the best of times, airlines tend to work on 2-3% margins when you're lucky. So when you incur a liability in the hundreds of millions, as Air New Zealand did with the collapse of Ansett Australia, and you've got all of this complexity, like what the heck do you do with all of these unused frequent flyer points that Ansett had amassed? What do you do with relationships in Star Alliance with airlines who recognize that you were the 100% owner of the parcel when the music stopped? That was a very, very challenging time for Air New Zealand. And the thing that shocked me as a new arrival into New Zealand was how almost embarrassed and ashamed people were of their flag carrier. There was almost a stigma that, if you could have made an error of judgment in that perspective, and of course, everyone's an expert after the event, that people were almost embarrassed to talk about Air New Zealand. So it was a difficult and a challenging time. And I came into the commercial environment initially to run the loyalty scheme and the alliances and their airline partnerships, and then took on the broader marketing role within Air New Zealand. And it was enormously challenging. But we were like a band of brothers and sisters. It was a tremendous collaborative effort. I am still in touch with almost all of the people that I worked with back in 2001, 2002, because I still think we look at each other sometimes and think, how did we turn that around?
Yeah.
And in the space of 18 months, and under the guidance of a chief executive, I'd say is still one of the most brilliant people I've ever worked with, Sir Ralph Norris, we turned a $600 million liability into $1.8 billion of cash reserves, simply by getting the basics right and by keeping the business simple and by honoring promises and honoring commitments, paying our supply chain on time, and gradually people regained that pride in the airline that they'd lost during the Ansett Australia time.
Yeah, look, it's an incredible story, an incredible achievement, and Air New Zealand has been one of those fascinating businesses, I think, to follow from so many aspects, and there must be a lot of lessons, but for you, it seems with Ansett there was just too much complexity there, and Air New Zealand got that right from keeping things a lot simpler.
Yeah, I think we all sometimes in our industry think you can make more margin by mystifying the business. If you can confuse the customer, then the customer can't fix a price point. And some people think there's profit to be gained by creating complex businesses. I tend to think exactly the opposite. I think I always like the distinction between businesses that are simple to run, but not easy. And there's a world of difference between those positions. And I think airlines are, if you drive revenue up, you drive costs down, you take risk out, and you push talent up, you can run an airline. It's that simple. But at times we overcomplicate, and certainly Ansett significantly overcomplicated, and then you end up over-resourcing and you run a cost base that you can't possibly sustain. And that was the lesson that Air New Zealand learned. And, people talk about moments in your career that are what, supposedly called crucible moments that you remember. But certainly the collapse of Ansett and the rebirth of Air New Zealand is absolutely one of those crucible times for me that, probably made me the leader that I am today.
Oh. So when you got to, how did that actual transition work with Ansett shutting down, and then you found yourself within the Air New Zealand business? So were you originally employed as part of Air New Zealand, or just how did that all fit together?
I had a bit of a dual role.
Yeah, okay.
So part of my role was working for Ansett Australia and running these two large travel agents, but I was effectively an Air New Zealand employee.
Right.
So I knew where my loyalty lay. But that said, when Ansett collapsed, I mean, Air New Zealand laid off a huge number of people, and I was an unknown person. Effectively, I was just a name on a payroll. I'd been in Melbourne, obviously. Air New Zealand was headquartered in Auckland, but the chief operating officer was a guy called Andrew Miller, and he had really persuaded me to come in to run these travel agencies because of my background, both at Virgin and in the UK. And we were facing a pretty tough time in Melbourne. My wife, as a Kiwi, you couldn't, at that time, it sounds ridiculous, but you couldn't go and order a coffee with a New Zealand accent without somebody in Australia saying, you bloody Kiwis, you just killed our Australian icon, you killed our airline. It was a really tough time to be a New Zealander in Melbourne. My wife found it particularly hard. But one time we were going out for lunch thinking, now what do we do? We've emigrated from the UK. We had a 3-year-old daughter. Our son was born around that time. He'd just been born in the north of England. So it's a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old, 12-month-old. And my wife and I were out at a cafe, and she went to go and get a coffee, and my phone rang, and it was this Andrew Miller, the chief operating officer, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, not a lot. And he said, do you want to come over to Auckland? And I went, yeah, when do I start? And he said, how about next Monday? So when my wife came back from ordering the coffee, I said, we're going to Auckland. And that's how I made the transition from Melbourne to Auckland. It was entirely down to Andrew. And we really haven't looked back since. I think of my life my professional life in two halves, the first 15 years in the UK and really the last 20 between Australia and New Zealand and latterly Canada, as you mentioned in your intro. Mm-hmm. But it's almost also in 3/3. That was, I started life in typical middle management or junior in middle management. Then I spent, I guess, a good chunk of that early time at Air New Zealand in senior management at their executive suite, working first for Ralph Norris, then for Rob Fyfe, who took over as CEO in 2004. And then when I left, a guy called Christopher Luxon took my job. So, it's been a great privilege to work with some very high profile New Zealanders. And then I've spent the last 10 years as a chief exec. So, it's been a great run. But I think sometimes it's good to look back in your life and think, actually, those have been really interesting chapters over, very different looking decades.
Mm. And so what did that role look like when you came to Auckland?
Oh, look, it was pretty broken. We had no money. And was it Ernest Rutherford who once said, I had no money, so I had to think. And we had to think. We had no resources. And, one of the great early, there's two examples of how we operated without any money. One was at the time, a relatively unknown New Zealander called Peter Jackson had this concept of developing these films around Tolkien's great novels, The Lord of the Rings. And he was, at the time, flying on Qantas, and New Zealand were not giving him a great deal of support. So I loved the idea. I'd been brought up on the Lord of the Rings books. As I said, my dad was an English academic, so that was kind of staple for me. Yep. So I approached the producers of the films, the company called New Line Cinema, part of Warner Brothers, and I said, how about we call ourselves the Airline to Middle Earth and we operate these aircraft as flying billboards for your movies? And they went, yeah, that's great. We'll charge you X million dollars for the privilege. And I went, no, I'd like to do it for nothing. And they just laughed me out of the place and said, never come back. And we ended up doing an extraordinary deal that cost Air New Zealand nothing. And we ran the characters. There was a Frodo plane. There was a Legolas plane. There was never a Gandalf plane because I always thought he looked too much like God. And I didn't think people would want to get on that plane. But we had these wonderful pictures And it became an enormous magnet for the country. And I'd forgotten, maybe not realized, Lord of the Rings was a huge concept in Germany, huge in the Scandinavian countries, enormous in Japan. And it almost put New Zealand on the map, but it really put Air New Zealand on the map because we were called the official airline to Middle-earth. And it was this great marketing deal that cost us almost nothing. And the other deal, I remember coming back to my connections with the Virgin Group. At the time, back in 2006, Rob Fife asked me to take on running the international airline, the whole operation everywhere beyond domestic New Zealand. And our product, our seats on board, our in-flight entertainment was pretty tired. It was old. It had really run its course.
And it was a night and day difference.
It wasn't good
from where it was to where it
absolutely
became.
And
I still remember, flying some of those.
We used to have the sheepskin covers on the seats, and they used to be very narrow, and a lot of the seats were broken. And as I said,
the old business class compared to modern, I mean.
But Rob,
you just couldn't compare the two.
Absolutely. And Rob's a pretty challenging guy. And he said to me, I really want you to transform the business class, and you've got 6 to 12 months to do it. And I said, well, you can't do it because these seats, take a long time to develop, and they take a long time to evaluate and purchase. And he had traveled on the Virgin Atlantic business class, and they had this concept called a dream suite, which was a herringbone seat. And he said, well, you used to work for Virgin. I want that seat. I went, well, yeah, it's not quite that simple. But in fact, I ended up contacting Richard Branson, and I said, how would it operate if we operated these seats under license from you? And he named some huge sum of money that he wanted me to pay for the license. And we did some math. And I worked out that if we could get the premium that I thought we'd get for that herringbone concept business class seat, we'd actually repay the license in 12 months. And we did it in 8 months.
Wow.
And it was a total transformation. And so we developed that business class seat. We developed a premium economy seat called the space seat that was splayed and faced different directions. So you're never in eyesight.
So there wasn't a lie flat before that.
No,
before that seat,
no,
right?
They'd never had a fully lie flat, and it had about a 20-degree angle, which was really uncomfortable when you're flying the sort of distances. Because I think sometimes we as Kiwis forget Air New Zealand flies longer than any other airline around the world because of the dent of where we are on the globe.
That's right.
So when you've got a 20-degree angle on a bed, it makes a huge difference to move to a lie flat. And the other challenge that Rob gave me, because he loved giving me really difficult challenges, was, can you develop a concept that's going to allow someone to lie flat in economy? And your first reaction is, well, it's not possible. And so I worked with a design agency from Palo Alto in California called IDEO. And they were some of the more challenging people I've worked with in my career, because they started from the precept. They said, you do realize, don't you, that everybody hates your product? And, when you're in the commercial environment, you immediately bristle and you get quite resentful. How can you hate our product? It's a wonderful product. And they said, it's just boring. You're sitting in a metal tube for 14 hours, to San Francisco or Vancouver or, even worse, to London. People don't like doing it. So we tried to think, and we modeled at the time, because I had 2 young kids, how would parents travel if they had 2 young kids? How could you develop a concept where at least the kids could sleep? And that led to a concept of what became the Air New Zealand Sky Couch. And we literally developed the first concept with orange boxes, and working out how, if you could pull a recline seat up to 45, 50 degrees, you could actually turn that into a fully flat surface. And that's how the Air New Zealand Sky Couch first evolved in 2008. And I, at the time, didn't fully appreciate quite how radical a concept that was until we came to launch it and came to announce it. And of course, we had to keep it all in secret. We developed and prototyped those actually in a hangar on Fanshawe Street that nobody knew. It was just a warehouse. We gave it a hangar to give it a fancy title. We called it Hangar 9.
Yeah.
And we were developing all these prototypes in secret. And then we couldn't work out how we could test them, because if we tested them with our own staff, they would have a tendency to tell you what they think you wanted to hear.
Yeah.
If you tested them with the customer, there was no way you could guarantee that the customer would keep it secret and not blurt it out. So we hired actors. And this was back in the time of the global financial crisis in 2008. There were an awful lot of out-of-work actors. So we used to pay them to come into this warehouse and sit in these seats for 10 hours and test how they reacted. And we'd simulate the noise of engines. We'd simulate the exact temperature. We'd actually have crew serving them in the hangar so that we could test how the service flow worked. It was brilliant. It was such good fun testing these things in real time. And that is literally how the Sky Couch came out. And the Sky Couch, I'm proud to say, is still flying today in 2022. And in fact, when I came back from Canada, I flew on a Sky Couch, and I thought, this still holds up pretty well. It was a pretty neat concept. So, a couple of examples of just showing how sometimes you can have too much money and it stops people thinking. And when you've really cash constrained, as we were, in that first decade of the new millennium, we really had to think, and we came up with some great concepts.
That's fantastic. And how did you develop as a leader through this period? What were the ways that you developed, and how you steered culture and so on, alongside the other leaders within the business, and created a good environment? How did that play out for you?
One of the great transitions for me, I was very fortunate in 2004. I learned about an entity called the Institute of Strategic Leadership, ISL. There's a guy called Jeff Lorigan who was running the Institute, and he used to have sort of week-long forums down in Queenstown. And I went to one of those forums, and it was the first time, despite having been in the commercial world for almost 20 years at that point, it was the first time that people talked about a concept called values-based leadership. And I remember vividly saying to Jeff, values schmallies, what does all that mean? But the reason that Rob Fife at the time was keen for me to go to the Institute was, unbeknown to me, he was going to shift me from the commercial environment, which was my comfort zone, into the operational world, and make me accountable for pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, cleaners, baggage handlers, people who, some of whose jobs I'd done, but others like pilots whose jobs technically were way beyond my capability. And what I learned from that time, and what was my key attribute, I guess, to make that transition, Paul, was thinking about what were the values that actually drove me both professionally and personally. And I thought about, I'm quite a resilient person. I talked about what had happened post 9/11, in the UK, and helping the UK recover post Gulf War. So resilience, I was always accountable. I was always one of those people who put my hand up to take on extra responsibility and take responsibility for bad things as well as for good things. I felt I was very aspirational. Having started life as a check-in agent, I'd really developed a taste for being a senior executive, in an airline at that point. But I still, I always think it's as important to think about where you come from as where you're going. So I still thought of myself as a, kind of Swansea boy who'd never been on a plane till he was 21. So I was quite humble. So, a combination of those values made me more confident and comfortable dealing with highly technical professionals like wide-bodied pilots who might have been doing their job, at a time when I was still in school. So what would give me the confidence to say I could give something to their professional role where they certainly didn't need my technical input or technical competence? And so those values inspired me to think about how we could broaden the business education for pilots, for flight attendants, not in a patronizing way. They're super smart people, but they didn't always understand necessarily, why do you fly to a certain route? Why do you buy one aircraft over another? Why do you buy a Boeing rather than an Airbus aircraft? Why do you buy a lie flat bed rather than a non-reclining seat? And what are the economics behind those decisions? Why do we invest in, great wines in business class? What difference can that possibly make to the life of a customer? And I found that particularly amongst technical professionals, there was a tremendous appetite for broadening their business knowledge.
Yeah,
but in a very humble way.
I can imagine that. Yeah, I can imagine that being the case, but it just wasn't the norm at that point.
It was not the norm, and if anything, there was quite a trust deficit. I remember walking into a group of, at the time, 747 jumbo jet pilots, and I walked in to talk to them about business education, and they just laid into me about all the terrible things that the airline had done to them over the previous 20 or 30 years. Yeah. And I remember, this is possibly where the resilience kicked in. I remember saying to this pilot class, because they pulled me apart, and I remember saying, I can't be judged by the events of the last 30 years, but you can hold me accountable for everything that happens from today onwards, and I will be measured by that. And it was a pretty harrowing experience. But next week, I went back to another group of pilots, and it wasn't as bad. And the third week, it was pretty good. And the fourth week, we were almost friends. And that's where I think, airline or the aviation world and any transportation world teaches you business resilience. It teaches you that it isn't about the experience, it's how you recover from the experience. And that was really put to the test in late November 2008, when Air New Zealand lost an aircraft off the south coast of France at a place called Perpignan. And it was an A320 aircraft that had been on loan to a German charter operator called XL. But in the transition between the German operator and handing it back to Air New Zealand, we had 2 of our pilots and 3 of our engineers on board. And that plane went down due to a whole set of well-documented circumstances. And we had rehearsed, and it sounds bizarre, but we did tabletop exercises and we did full-blown emergency simulations of crises. We did a full-blown rehearsal every 6 months, and we did a tabletop exercise every 3 months. And the advantage, as shocking as it was, and I took the first phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning about the loss of that aircraft, we all knew what our respective roles were. And we'd all agreed that Rob, as the chief exec, would fly as quickly as we could possibly get him to the site and go with the next of kin and start the process of managing the accident investigation process. And for my sins, my designated role was the media spokesperson and communicating to staff. And, again, that was one of those crucible moments where you suddenly walk into a room and you're having microphones and cameras thrust in your face. Nobody's letting you get away. I mean, they're hounding you and pursuing you because everybody is asking a variation on the same question. What happened? And you're going back with a variation on the same answer. It's too early to tell. I can't tell you. But as tragic, and it was a desperately sad, because, they were 5 extraordinary Air New Zealanders with 5 wonderful families. And it was a terrible loss to the country. But it was one of those experiences that none of us who ever went through it, like the collapse of Ansett, will ever forget. And again, I think I relied very heavily on my values. I'd go home every night and think, was I accountable? Was I resilient? Did I stay humble? And I think if the answer to the question you ask through your own values is, yes, I'm still comfortable with the person I am, and yes, I think I was authentic and I think I was honest, then you can carry on. I think if you start finding yourself contradicting your leadership values, then it becomes really difficult to acquit how you're behaving to yourself. But, I think we did a reasonable job. I think we honored those 5 brilliant men. I think we did a lot of worthy respect for the sacrifice that they made. And a lot of airlines would have gone through, an extraordinarily difficult period by losing an aircraft. It was very difficult for us personally, but I think we recovered remarkably well. But again, one of those kind of harrowing times in a career that you never forget.
Yeah, and these things, there's just no way that you can fully plan for them, right? You talked about all the things that you've done up front to be prepared, but it doesn't completely prepare you, does it? Obviously it meant you kind of knew what you had to do to a reasonable degree. But how hard was that for you to, have to front the media and be involved in interactions
Yeah.
with so many people that would have found it a very, very difficult time.
The the thing that's almost impossible to prepare for when you do those simulation exercises is how long they go on for. When you do an exercise, it might go on for a half a day, it might go on for a full day. And then the exercise finishes and you go, oh, yeah, that was really tough, but it's finished and it's behind us. You lose an aircraft, it never finishes. And that was the big lesson for me when it came, many years later, and completely unsuspectingly for me that came back during COVID, is that it never finishes. It's with you in the evening and it's with you when you wake up the next morning. So at that time, that was the big lesson for me, was, as I said, I'd taken that first phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was literally driving off the Esmond Road ramp, and I nearly went off the road when my colleague in London had rung me to tell me that we'd lost an aircraft. And I was still there that night, and I was still there the next morning. And I think that's the lesson, is the value of support teams, the value of having people who are constantly saying, now it's time for you to take a break. I've got this for your lunch. It's the simple actions of somebody actually providing food and making sure that we're, in the words of an airline, you're putting on your own oxygen mask before you think of others. And sometimes you forget that. Yeah. And there was an extraordinary moment on the Saturday morning when we were in the crisis room. So we'd been there in that room for 24 hours. And we were preparing for a press conference. And I knew it was going to be a really tough press conference, because this was the time the media had broken. And my mobile rang, and it was a number I didn't recognize. And it was the transport minister, who at the time was Stephen Joyce. And he said, I know you're about to go into the press conference. He said, I want to wish you luck, which was a great thing for the transport minister to ring me. And he said, myself and the Prime Minister are going to be in the area, and we know that you're going to do a staff briefing after the press conference. Would you like us to come and join you? And, talk about a reminder of what an extraordinary country New Zealand really is when we're at our best. By the time I'd done this very harrowing press conference, I stood up to speak to about 500 staff. I still get quite emotional thinking about it now, because they were all in tears.
Yeah.
But, on my right shoulder, I had the Transport Minister, Stephen Joyce, and on my left shoulder, I had the Prime Minister, John Key. And that was an example of how the country comes together at a time of crisis, and how that support network really helps you through. So, of course, you rely heavily on your internal values, but you have to call on other people too. So it was, it was an extraordinarily tough time, but I think you also have to remember, whatever I was going through was nothing compared to what the families were going through. There's always somebody doing it tougher than you. And that, again, I think was a really important lesson for me when it came to navigating through COVID.
Yeah, I think often it's these toughest times that just can't be predicted, that really mold us and sort of make us who we become. Right.
Oh, I think you have to look, deep into yourself and say, do I really want to be doing this job? Do I want to be the person? And, there is part of you that also says, I back myself. I have confidence I can do this. Maybe not better than it. It's not a competitive thing, but I can do it as well as anybody. And, I'd had some pretty tough formative experiences, and those experiences really do come to play in an environment that is as highly charged and highly emotional. And Air New Zealanders, we called ourselves Air New Zealanders. They were, a breed of relatively tough people, and the support came right across the entity. So I would have baggage handlers, I would have cleaners come up to me and thank me for the job that I did as media spokesperson. I look back now, it's still, everything we do now is still alive everywhere on some form of media. And there's a program called Mayday that I think still runs on Discovery Channel. And I've only had the strength to kind of look at it a couple of times, and I really look like a possum trapped in the headlights. I look absolutely overwhelmed, but we navigated it and we did it. And again, a bit like the ANZAC collapse, I remember who all my colleagues were, and I remember the role that each of us played over that time. And there's an extraordinary bond between everybody who navigated that period.
Now, from in New Zealand, you moved across and took on the role of chief executive at Airways.
Yeah.
Airways New Zealand. That's quite a shift. How did that come together? How did
well, I guess at that point I realized I was becoming an aviation nerd, and I recognized that, an airline is part of an ecosystem, and an airline has a huge dependency on visible support partners like airports, but also on less visible support partners like air traffic control. And air traffic control is one of those extraordinary disciplines that the general public is only aware of when something goes wrong. So if a flight gets delayed or a process breaks down at an airport, then people start saying, flaming ATC, but the rest of the time they have no visibility of it. And in 2010, before I'd made the decision to join, there was a major incident at Auckland Airport when all the runway lights failed. And I was rung, I think it was about 7, 8 o'clock at night on a Saturday night. Thankfully, I hadn't had a beer by that stage, but I was rung by the duty manager of Air New Zealand at Auckland Airport saying, all the runway lights have failed. We've just delayed all of our long-haul flights, and we told people they're going to be delayed for hours. It's chaos at the airport. Everybody's really upset about it. Can you come up and do something about it? So I went up to help, and literally I went to the countdown at the airport and bought, at the time, because we realized we weren't going to get these planes away that night. So I think we bought something like 600 tubes of toothpaste and toothbrushes and blankets and any kind of emergency supplies that we could actually get through security.
Wow.
And get them airside. And at the time, what was fascinating for me was myself and the duty manager and a group of colleagues were doing everything we could, but we couldn't see other representatives of the aviation industry. And I was thinking, wow, surely people from Airways should be here to come and help. And in a funny way, Paul, that lent me to think maybe this could be an organization that could do with, the broader customer sense of accountability that I'd learned from being with an airline. So in a bizarre way, it became a job ad for me to think, how could I make a difference to that organization? And I think I'd also got to the point of, having been a senior executive, and Rob was very clearly, very successful at Air New Zealand and wasn't going to go anywhere, that I thought, well, maybe I'd back myself to go and be a chief executive of a smaller operation.
Yes.
And Airways had 700 people, roughly split between a mixture of air traffic controllers and engineers, but like running an organization of pilots, all very technically proficient. And it was also an organization itself being headquartered in Christchurch that was going through huge challenges, because I joined very shortly after February 2011, after the Christchurch earthquakes. So again, I felt that my leadership experience from some of the stories we were sharing earlier could actually be of benefit to Airways and to people who are very heavily traumatized themselves by the Christchurch earthquakes. And I thought it was a wonderful organization. It was also a state-owned enterprise.
Yeah.
So it was the first time that I'd had direct
Government
accountability
entity.
for working with government, both with the finance minister and the minister for SOEs and the transport minister. And fascinating for me to be part of this broader ecosystem of aviation, and wonderful people down there. And again, a bit like those 747 pilots, people who'd been there 30, 40 years from the time that it was still part of the Civil Aviation Authority.
Now, I'm keen to get to hear a little bit about WestJet, but before we do that, what do you think were the main takeaways from that time and your learnings as chief executive?
The thing I learned there was the thing that I'd never learned as an unsuccessful sports person, which is, how do you create time for yourself? When I watch somebody like Roger Federer, how is it that Roger Federer, or how is it that somebody like Ricky Ponting from the Australian cricket team always seem to have more time than anybody else on a sporting field? And not long after I joined Airways, I was in the approach area of at Auckland Airport one night, talking to a relatively young controller. The average age of air traffic controllers tends to be kind of my age, or mid-50s. And this young lady was about 25. and I was watching, and she was separating a Airbus, Emirates Airbus A380 from a Air New Zealand Boeing 777. So you got 500 people relying on her to create adequate separation. And she was preparing the flight paths for the two aircraft, but she was still talking to me, and she was about to go on the radio. And I said to her, how does it feel when you've got a minute to keep 500 lives separated? And she turned to me without blinking and said, well, I'm wondering what you want me to do with the other 59 seconds. And I thought that, for me, was the perfect epitome of how you create time, because time's all relative. She knew what she could do in a second relative to what she could do in 60 seconds. And she knew that effectively, by planning the right flight trajectory, she knew she was in total control of what she was doing. So what did I learn? I learned the importance of composure. I learned the importance of calm, and I learned the importance of planning. And, from my time at Airways, I developed a mantra that I then took into WestJet that Canadians would kind of roll their eyes because they heard it from me so many times, which was structure, process, discipline. I was very structured in the way that I planned. I loved process, but I was very disciplined in the way that I managed myself. I was in an environment with air traffic controllers where they respected that discipline. And so that's what I took from my time running a state-owned enterprise as part of this broader ecosystem. We had great relationships with the Civil Aviation Authority, a great relationship with the Ministry of Transport that I still have, thankfully, to this day. But it was because you learn from the professionals for whom you're responsible the value of planning ahead and anticipation.
Excellent. So you're in New Zealand, you're chief executive for Airways. You ended up in Canada. What happened? Why would you want to leave New Zealand? I mean, come on.
Well, I'd mentioned earlier some of the work that I've been doing around the Sky Couch, and there was a guy running an airline in Canada called WestJet, and he rang me out of the blue sometime in 2010, and he said, "Hi, my name's Greg Soretsky. I've seen a lot of the work you're doing. I'd love you to come and work at WestJet." And it was around Christmas time, and we were on Wahiki Island, and I said, "Well, WestJet had a great reputation. They'd been producing these brilliant social media campaigns called Christmas Miracle and April Fools, and they built this great reputation of being a very entrepreneurial airline." So part of me was thinking, well, this is quite exciting, because I was just about to go and join Airways at the time. And then I kind of looked at my phone and looked at the weather map, and it was 25 degrees on Wahiki, and it was minus 25 in Calgary. So I kind of thought about it for about an hour, and I went back to Greg and said, absolutely no. How does anyone survive minus 25? I said, but let's keep in touch. And during my time at Airways, I was building a dialogue with WestJet and just keeping a conversation going. And then Greg rang me sometime in 2016, and he said, we really want to get into the whole world of long-haul flying and wide-body jets. And I'm doing an evaluation at the moment between an Airbus aircraft and a Boeing aircraft. And he said, you brought both the 777s and the 787s into Air New Zealand. Which way would you go? And he knew what he was doing. He was pulling me in. It was like I was on the hook, and he was just reeling me in. So then I said to my wife, well, maybe minus 30 isn't so bad. Maybe it's just about the clothes you wear rather than the temperature outside, which she never believed for a second. But I guess I'd got Airways into a position where when I took over the company, it was loss-making, marginally, just break even. And we developed a really successful international business, and we were selling some really smart, sophisticated training, revenue management, flight planning tools. So we were net profitable to a pretty good degree, and giving that benefit back to our airlines. So I really did feel at that point I'd probably taken Airways as far as I could. So I did eventually say to my wife, maybe we could see how life would work at WestJet. So I went in to work for Greg. He was still CEO at the time, and I took on the role of Chief Commercial Officer in 2017. And so we made Canada our home. And I thought, I've lived in 3 Commonwealth countries so far. Maybe a fourth would feel familiar, and it did.
Yeah. And so what was that initial role that you stepped into with WestJet?
So the job title was Chief Commercial Officer. I was running all of the sales, marketing, revenue management, network planning, product development side of the businesses, plus all of the digital side, loyalty, alliances. So it was a reasonably broad perspective on it. But Greg had also made it plain to me that he'd been in the top job for about 8 years at that point, and he was going to move on at some stage. So, it was never assured and never guaranteed, but there was always a thought in the back of both our minds that I might take over from him. And that happened after I'd been there about 9 months.
Wow. So that was quite a quick transition. And I guess it gave you some time to understand the business and the varying aspects across that 9 months. Was that quite hard to come from New Zealand, completely new business, to get your head around everything, and then quite quickly you're responsible for the entire business?
Well, clearly I'd moved from a country of 5 million people to a country of 36 million. I think the biggest complexity really in Canada is the distinction between the states and the provinces and national politics. So,
yes.
The eastern states like Quebec, Ontario operate in a completely different way to the place I was based. So my first priority was really to understand the country and the psyche of the people. And then secondly, what was WestJet's role relative to the national carrier Air Canada, and how effectively could we compete? So yes, it was tough, but I guess from an academic background, I've always been quite a fast learner. So I challenged myself to learn, and I had a wonderful chair who was the entrepreneurial founder of WestJet in the first place back in 1996, a guy called Clive Beddoe. And he was incredibly generous with his time. And he gave me, some invaluable insights into the Canadian market, into the Canadian psyche. It's very different to New Zealand. I came to appreciate how direct and candid New Zealanders can be. And Canadians pride themselves on being incredibly polite. And it's wonderful, and they are genuinely very polite people, but sometimes it can take them a heck of a long time to get to the point. So sometimes a bit of Kiwi candor, as well as Kiwi can do, actually made a huge difference.
Yeah. So coming into the business, what were the things that needed your attention and needed your focus?
Well, the first thing that struck me, I remember Rob Fife used to talk about Air New Zealand having to earn the right to grow. Organizations don't have a divine right to grow. And WestJet was actually growing too fast and growing too big. So, it sounds counterintuitive, but one of the first things I had to do was actually rein in some of our forward aircraft orders and some of our route expansion plans, and actually try and scale back and say, let's make sure that we cover our bases first before we can expand too fast. So that one of the first things I did, which wasn't hugely popular, was actually, contract and make sure that we were growing profitably rather than growing for its own sake, making sure we had the right aircraft. So I made sure that we did order a Boeing wide-bodied aircraft and make sure that we could operate that profitably. And I I've always believed in downside risk management. I had a glass half full CFO, so I had to be the glass half empty CEO to think, how bad could things get? And that wasn't trying to be wise after the event or anticipating COVID. But I guess I needed to make sure that we were sustainable for the long term. And then, in 2019, we were a publicly listed company. We were trading very successfully on the Toronto Stock Exchange. I became aware of an interest from a private equity firm, and that private equity firm started speaking to us in earnest in March 2019, and then made a bid for us. At the time, the bid was about 35% over our trading share price on the Friday night. And so we sold the entity, and that became obviously hugely time consuming for me. I was literally running an airline during the day and running the bid during the night. But we sold, as you mentioned in your intro, for around 5.5 billion Canadian dollars. And that deal finally went through in December 2019. So these wonderful people, Onyx, private equity owners, had 2 glorious months of running a hugely successful operation until COVID hit at the end of February, and our lives changed completely. So yeah, I kept myself pretty busy in the time that I was running the operation.
Yeah. So what's it like to go through, that sort of process of that, private equity offer in terms of your role, the board's role? How does that, fit together? I've, been monitoring or, watching a few businesses go through, different sale and purchase type processes and so on. What did that look like?
I think there, a couple of processes that really struck me when I look back. One, of course, is the need for extreme confidentiality. You are a listed company, and if there had been the slightest whisper, we would have got in huge trouble for insider trading. And of course, there is a lot of vigilance around insider trading for good reason in markets like the US and Canada. So the first thing was I could only have 12 WestJetters working on that deal. The deal took 12 weeks from start to finish, and we exchanged 77,000 documents over 12 weeks. So the first thing I would say is intensity.
That sounds
It was
incredibly
exhausting, absolutely exhausting. And again, those 12 WestJetters were remarkable people. I mean, again, their ability to assimilate and disseminate information. The other lesson that I learned, and you asked about the role of boards, is you have a widely divergent view on valuation. And some board members are thinking, ka-ching, maybe we could sell this at 120% over a premium. Others are saying, well, are we going to justify even getting a premium over your publicly listed price? So one of the hardest aspects was actually trying to establish the buy price, because clearly the private equity owners want to buy it as cheaply as possible, and we want to sell at the top end as possible. So trying to find that final price plus all of the details, because I'm not doing that negotiation for the board. I'm not doing the negotiation for the owners. I'm doing it for 14,500 people. One of the extraordinary aspects of WestJet was that 86% of our staff were actually shareholders in the business.
Wow.
So I wanted the best deal for every pilot, every baggage handler, every check-in agent that I could possibly get. And so I guess that's what I learned, is who are you doing this for? And are you doing this, again, in line with your values? And is there a real sense of purpose in doing this deal? But, I do remember the day after we struck the deal was probably the first time I'd slept in those 12 weeks, without being tormented by where do you fix that price?
Yeah. Yeah. And what was the key to landing on the price?
I think the quality of our assets. Myself and my CFO spend a lot of time with fixed income fund managers down in New York, and you're dealing with some of the shrewdest financial brains you'll ever see. What we had were really high quality assets. We had brand new aircraft. We had a great network structure. We had a fantastic loyalty scheme, but we weren't selling intangible assets. We weren't selling, slots or bridges or potential forward business from the loyalty scheme. We sold the loyalty scheme as a liability rather than as an asset. So we were very honest and very direct. And we actually ended up raising more debt than equity behind the deal. But these guys were happy to do it because they liked our story and they liked our market position. And when you've got a country with 35 million people, you need 2 really robust airlines at least, because it's tough weather. You're flying through snow and ice and extreme weather conditions. You need 2 really well-funded business models to be able to operate in those conditions.
Yep. So you did the sale, and then what? How many weeks was it until COVID?
About 9. When we concluded the sale, which was in mid-December, and the first sign of COVID, and gosh, talk about crucible moments. It was a leap year, February the 29th. It was a Sunday afternoon. And, I mentioned earlier, I'm a bit of a nerd. So what I used to do on a Sunday afternoon was just look at 2 indicators, 2 indices that determined what the rest of the week was going to look like. One was what I called our actual flown revenue, so how many passengers had flown with us over the last week. And the other is booked. And people very often are booking 18 months, 2 years out. So I was looking at flown, and that all looked fine. And I'm looking at booked, and my whole screen went red. It just went red, like a trading screen. And so my immediate thought was, jeepers, our booking system's gone down. So I rang our CIO and I said, what have you done? Have you taken our system down? Like, my whole screen's gone red. And he went, I don't know what's going on. And of course, we'd been reading about Wuhan, and we'd been reading about, what had been coming out of China initially. And, I used to occasionally talk on non-confidential issues with my counterpart at Air Canada, and he said, we're starting to see bookings really slow down out of Asia. We weren't flying to and from Asia at the time. And I thought, maybe this is it. And then we had, from February the 29th, we had 72 consecutive days where we had more cancellations in a day than we had new bookings. And that was partly because nobody was booking, but partly also because everyone was just canceling like crazy. I never thought an airline could survive one day where you had net cancellations outstripping revenue, but 72 days was just unbelievable. I had a day in May, it was May the 20th, 2020, when I had 700 people flying us. A typical day,
700 in a whole day.
A typical day would be 75,000. So I realized I'd gone down to less than 1% of my normal revenue. So you do start thinking, how do you survive this? How can you possibly navigate it? And trying to explain that to a new private equity owner who's just paid, many $1 billion for you was a tough conversation.
Yeah. So what did you do to get through that window through to you retired late 2021? So you didn't just sort of abandon ship and leave it for somebody else to deal with.
I'd like to think I kind of modeled my inner President Zelensky, but when you think of the courage of Zelensky at the end of February saying that, he was not going to take the first flight out of Kyiv. I was not going to take the first flight back to New Zealand. I could think of 100 things. Let me take it down to two for time's sake, Paul. One was we cut costs. We were tough on cost. I had 180 aircraft. I almost immediately parked 150 of them. We didn't think. We just said we can't operate more than 30 aircraft. Not when you're down to, only 1% of your revenue. And sadly, we cut staff. And I had to let 10,500 staff go. But what we tried to do, I come back to how do you create time for yourself? How do you plan? So having grounded the aircraft, I knew I just didn't have enough work for the people of WestJet. So we planned and we said, how do we give people options on working from home, early retirement, part-time working? I don't just want to be this brutal person who says 10,500 of you don't turn up for work tomorrow. How can you give people, even if it's only a week, time to think? Maybe this is the time you take early retirement. Maybe you want to only work 2 days a week. Maybe you are going to take a 6-month sabbatical and come back and talk to us again in September. So we gave people time. And I honestly think that repaid itself so many times over when you come through the worst and you start those phone calls saying, would you like to come back to work? If you've treated people with humanity and you've treated them with a degree of humility, thinking, how would I feel if I was taking that call? Then people are more inclined to come back. And they did come back. And we did find when we came through it that people were happy to come back. I think cutting costs early and treating people with real humanity and thinking like on the other side, not shying away from difficult conversations. Being an English student, I could have put 100 great business quotes up on my whiteboard to remind me every day, but I had one from novelist Joseph Conrad, and it said, face it. That's always the way to get through. It's always facing it. And I thought, you've got to face it.
Yeah.
You just got to stare it head down.
Wow. There's a whole lot more I would love to unpack, but I realise we've been through our time. So I might be twisting your arm afterwards to see if we can maybe get you back
Be a pleasure.
Another time. Been absolutely fascinating, Ed. Anything else you'd like to leave listeners with in terms of, a little, any final pieces of advice
let's just,
from your business journey?
As Kiwis, let's just remind ourselves how lucky we are. I know it's been coined many times before. There was a great Fred Dagg song, but, we're in such a great position and the world wants what New Zealand has right now. Let's make the most of it. Let's get our confidence back. Let's stop beating ourselves up, get our confidence back, and get back into a position of taking on the world and winning. That's the New Zealand I came back to.
I like it. That's brilliant. All right. Thanks very much, Ed Sims. I really appreciate you sharing some of your insights and some of your story.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Paul.
Cheers.